think we're about to start. So welcome and good day, everyone. Many thanks for coming to this very exciting session about inclusive recovery and building back better in small island developing states. My name is Cindy Robles, and I work as a disaster risk management specialist at the World Bank in the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery. This session is specifically about the case of small island states. And why have we chosen to have a specific session on SIDS at the World Reconstruction Conference? As you all know, SIDS are among the most vulnerable countries to natural hazards due to higher levels of risk relative to their populations and economies. The SIDS are also at the front line of climate change, which is expected to greatly increase their exposure and vulnerability to natural hazards, including tropical storm surges, flooding, extreme winds, landslides, and slow onset events such as sea level rise, salinization, and drought. The SIDS in the Caribbean, Pacific, Africa, and Indian Ocean are heterogeneous, but they also share very unique and specific commonalities, such as the small size, geographic isolation, high depth with a narrow resource and export-based industries, and high infrastructure costs. They account for more than 2/3 of the countries with the highest average annual disaster losses between 1% to 9% of their GDP, and the costs continue to grow. And faced with these challenges, SIDS are already taking important steps to reduce, prepare, and better respond to future hazard events. And the growing experience really makes them champions of resilience. And bringing in the small island states practitioners' unique experiences, given their massive challenges, can teach us all very valuable lessons on how to build back better and inclusive recovery, and how that can help us all to build more inclusive and resilient societies, and that is why we're here today. And before I go into the details of the session, I would like to introduce you to our distinguished panel. And we are so happy to have you here, especially since I know that some of you have traveled over 30 hours to get here to share your experiences. First up is Ms. Elizabeth Riley. She's the Deputy Executive Director of the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, CEDIMA, with over 18 years of experience in disaster management and environmental management. So welcome, Ms. Riley. So next we have Ms. Victorina Legger, a structural engineer from the Ministry of Infrastructure in Tonga, and she has been deeply involved in the 2018 tropical cyclone Gita response and recovery. And she has worked closely with policymakers in drafting Tonga's first housing recovery policy, and she also works at the World Bank project for safer schools. So welcome, Ms. Legger. And then we have Ms. Mary Jack, a prominent women's rights leader from Vanuatu. She works as the provincial coordinator for Action Aid and is also the founder of Women Talk Together Forum, Women I Tuketa. I'm not sure if I pronounced it correctly, but we will talk more about this later. So welcome, Ms. Jack. And finally, we have Mr. Omar Sweeney, the manager of the Jamaica Social Investment Fund, which is the lead project management arm for the government of Jamaica. He has portfolio responsibility for the execution of several impactful social interventions and infrastructure projects within vulnerable communities across Jamaica. Welcome, Mr. Sweeney. And as you know, the theme of the World Reconstruction Conference is inclusive recovery, and this is because we all know that disasters are not neutral. They disproportionately affect the poorest, the most vulnerable, and the most marginalized, and this is of course the case for SIDS as well. So in the next 1.5 hours, we will therefore discuss several topics and approaches on how to ensure inclusion in recovery in the specific context of SIDS, and the principles of building back better, which has been operationalized through 3 dimensions: building back faster, stronger, and more inclusively. And the background for this session is a report called Building Back Better, Achieving Resilience Through Stronger, Faster, and More Inclusive Post-Disaster Reconstruction. And this report was launched by the World Bank and GFDRR in 2018. And it shows that a faster, stronger, and more inclusive recovery, particularly for SIDS, have high benefits. However, I think it's important to understand what building back better means in practice and what the challenges are to its implementation, and especially in SIDS, who are facing many challenges in managing their massive climate and disaster risks. So with this in mind, my first question goes to Ms. Riley. So, Ms. Riley, as mentioned, the Build Back Better report argues that there are great benefits for SIDS in building back faster, stronger, and more inclusively, and that the benefits are maximized if we can achieve them together. So based on your extensive experience in the Caribbean, what are the challenges in achieving this, and how can they be overcome?
Thank you. Good morning to everyone. Thanks very much, Cindy. And first, let me start by expressing my thanks to the GFDR team for inviting Sedima to be a part of today's conversation, which I think is a very important one. So I wanted to touch on maybe 4 of the key challenges, since I know we would not be able to address them all in the conversation. So I think, first of all, it's about the definition of the Build Back Better. And I think this is something that perhaps needs a bit of a deeper examination in reviewing the report, because from what I observed, most of the conversation around the Build Back Better is focused on the hydrometeorological related hazards. And certainly within the Caribbean context, and I know for a number of the other global regions of SIDS, the Build Back Better concept has to capture the multi-hazard context within which we operate. So for Caribbean SIDS, for example, the seismic hazards are also quite critical. I also wanted to mention the whole issue of the uncertainty as to what we are, for example, building stronger for. What are we really looking at? And in the report, there's the assumption of looking at, for example, events with a 1 to 50 year return period. And I think the report also correctly recognizes that there's a certain level of uncertainty related to the hydrometeorological hazards. So, for example, a 1 to 50 year return period event of today may be what would be the equivalent of maybe what would have been a 1 in 100 year return event of the future. So I think this is something we need to look at, and it certainly is a challenge. I think secondly is that within the context of SIDS, is related to the scale of the damage that happens to the built environment when we are impacted by hazards. And the damage to the built environment, of course, is not restricted only to the housing sector. And certainly we can pull housing statistics, for example, from Dominica, where we had in 2017, as a result of Maria, 226% of GDP damaged as a percentage of GDP, with 70 to 80% of the housing sector being impacted. But if you look at the broader scale of the damage to built environment really impacts on all sectors, where we're looking at public infrastructure, which, for example, is usually not covered by insurance. We're looking at damage to infrastructure across a number of key sectors, including tourism, which is one of the key economic earners for our states. So with this extent of scale in mind, the challenges that face many of the SIDS are related to limited human resources to address the scale of the recovery and reconstruction process that's required, and also physical and financial resources. And I think these are critical considerations for SIDS, particularly within an environment where many, certainly of the Caribbean states, have graduated from being able to access certain envelopes of resources. The third area I want to touch on is with respect to trying to address the sort of the 3 dimensions of the Build Back Better, and the fact that being able to build back stronger, faster, and inclusively may require some measure of trade-offs, particularly in our context, in the Caribbean context, where we have a hurricane season which comes back around every June. So, for example, in the aftermath of the 2017 events with Irma, Maria, and Jose, what we saw is that within 2018, much of the reconstruction, of course, had not yet restarted, but we had a reality of facing the challenge of trying to secure our populations with oncoming hurricane seasons. So out of necessity, sometimes you do find that the reconstruction efforts may not always take into consideration the three dimensions that are being tabled in the report. And the fourth challenge I wanted to touch on was really related to that underlying risk driver of poverty. Because, for example, Dominica's 2011 census had identified that 29% of the households in Dominica had been categorized as poor, and of those, 11% were categorized as very poor. And we all know that the implications of hazards tends to more disproportionately impact persons who are poor, because it has implications for locational vulnerability. We see issues related to land tenure, often where persons may not own the land on which their houses are constructed. It has implications for construction practices, because these tend to take place outside of the usual permitting and regulatory arrangements in country, and also for resources to support reconstruction. And also, we recognize, for example, coming out of the Caribbean Development Bank's Gender Assessment Synthesis Report, which was done quite recently, that generally we see that in terms of the rates of poverty, you find that the rates of poverty related to women tends to be a little bit higher than that of men. So I think in terms of looking at the whole reconstruction process, those underlying drivers are some of the challenges that we face. So in terms of some of the things that can be done to overcome these, I think one has to do with prior policy articulation and planning, particularly as it relates to recovery and the reconstruction process. So for example, in the SEDIMA system, we have articulated a model recovery framework, which is intended to support countries and to jumpstart ahead of the impacts of hazards, that whole conversation as to how recovery would be approached in country. I also think, secondly, that particularly from the lens of treating the area of inclusiveness, that there has to be a greater emphasis on the non-structural components of recovery. And very often it is the structural components that get heavier emphasis. And to give that emphasis to non-structural components, it means it has to be rooted within the policy statements that are articulated. So what we're talking about is, for example, how do we approach and prioritize the whole reconstruction effort, particularly as it relates to the residential sector, particularly looking at, for example, female-headed households, which we know within the Caribbean context, there's a certain, I mentioned the poverty considerations related to those before. And then we may also want to look at issues, for example, such as seasonality in the Caribbean, where you have some workers who are employed but really are quite marginal if you think about it, because they're employed, for example, in the hotel sector. And in some of our islands, these are very seasonal. So the income is linked to the tourism sector, to the tourism season, and in situations post-event where the hotels may have closed or not functioning, then you have persons really not necessarily having been in that vulnerable group before, but they're a marginal group, because then their income is taken away. And the final point I wanted to make is related to, I think there's certainly significant scope for strengthening the horizontal cooperation arrangements, certainly within the Caribbean, for addressing this whole issue of capacity to support the stronger and faster reconstruction through provision of surge support. And this is physical bodies who can support the reconstruction efforts, whether it be through engagement even of our militaries. And this is something that has been done in the past in the Caribbean, for example, in Montserrat, after the volcanic emergency. So I think there's a lot of scope there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Riley. So over to our next question. Ms. Legger, based on your experience with Cyclone Gita that hit Tonga last year and the reconstruction work that is currently undergoing, how do you think that Build Back Better can promote social resilience for the most vulnerable and marginalized communities and individuals? And how can we translate the concept of building back better and building back more inclusively, specifically, into concrete and practical actions on the ground? Is Build Back Better just a nice theory but impossible to implement in practice for some SIDS?
Thank you, Cindy. I would also, again, like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to share my experiences from my small island country of Tonga. First of all, this question has 3 parts, so I'll start with the first one. Build Back Better has been integrated to Tonga's National Development Strategy, so that's a big first step for Tonga. But really, it's a matter of a learning process, some sort of refinements and maximizing the outcome along the way. But how? How do we put this? How do we promote this? Firstly, my first point would be putting in place a new systems and policy, which what we're currently doing in Tonga now. And secondly, regarding inclusiveness. And thirdly, the duplication of data. This policy should heavily consider the 3 phases which are the immediate response to recovery and into reconstruction. In doing a recovery strategy, we should consider joining the 3 in order to have a more efficient and timely and effective response for our population. For example, from TC Cheetah, maybe you guys have all heard from our responses that one of it was cash disbursement, which clearly it's not supporting Build Back Better, but it was more of a political influence into it. But I'm just giving you an example, especially when there are limited resources, but we are trying to lesson learn along the way. The delay, regarding inclusiveness, the delay response in our recovery process is also related to the reliable data gathered in the aftermath of every event. And our local government have their social protection programs, which they identify the vulnerable people and female-headed household disability for criteria for vulnerability already in place when there's a cyclone hits. We are able to identify some of those people. But in any case, it's a matter of updating the data regularly so we can be able to make sure that no one is left behind. The duplication of data is also an issue. The affected and most vulnerable will not be able to engage in some cases because of the amount of surveys done, but has not received support, which it happens in Tonga. So government is trying to inform the affected people whether and how the government will assist with housing recovery as soon as possible, and when are they receiving the support, because they are vulnerable and they want the support not as soon as possible. The translation of Build Back Better into practical ground is the challenging part. Again, with our current government capacity and also NGOs capacity are limited. Working with the NGOs during the 3 phases, their capacity and resources are also limited. But the government is trying to keep in mind that every agency supporting housing recovery should be dedicated to empowering households to recover and should avoid taking on tasks that households are willing and able to do that for themselves. The recovery of government and households also depend on private sectors in our context on recovery, especially for private activities such as engineering, building supplies, construction trades, transport, and banking. The private sector should be engaged to help government identify ways to make housing recovery more efficient and cost-effective. Build Back Better, financing is the number one problem in small island developing states like Tonga, and the cost of imported materials are often expensive. So we can say Build Back Better are also expensive because there are also lack of locally available materials that are able to use as a standard because of its strength. So almost all the materials are imported. So it's also a challenge for Tonga to be facing trying to reconstruct in that way, but also can't afford it. And from an island that we don't have a lot of people are not often a lot of people in Tonga don't have insurance to their homes, so it is also a challenge to the government. So that's why the private sector should be engaged to help government identify ways to make the housing recovery more efficient in providing. Maybe the bank could have liaised with the government in ways to decrease the loan in that procedure. And the construction supply. Currently with TC Cheetah, we have tax exemption to have imported materials free to Tonga for this recovery, so that's a step up to Tonga. And we have so many other ways to improve, but like I said, it's a learning process along the way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Legger, for sharing those insights. So, Ms. Jack, you have played a significant role in increasing women's leadership in disaster preparedness and response in Vanuatu following Cyclone Pam in 2015. And because of your efforts, there are now thousands of women across the islands of Tana, Eromango, and Efate who are coming together to identify the needs, raise their voices, and demand that the government listen to what you have to say. How can we, based on your experience, encourage greater leadership and participation of women and girls in post-disaster recovery and to build back better? And what can we learn from your experiences with the Women I Tuk Tuk Tuketa network that you established?
Thank you for this honor to speak on behalf of the network that we set up in Vanuatu, and I hope this experience will further the cause of women to better build up their communities. Following the disaster in 2015, Cyclone Pam, ActionAid has given support to women in Vanuatu to set up a network called Women I Tuk Tuk Together. And that network is about women coming together collectively, taking leadership to take decisions and to address the protection rights. In this network, there are more than 4,000 women who have joined the network. and they are coming together to take leadership to address different issues during the time of disaster. I would like to say that it is important for women to take up leadership role during the time of disaster. As a woman representing this network of women, I think their voices are still not heard. The women on the ground, as grassroots women, even though they are not well educated, they have a perfect language to speak about disaster and climate change. They have a perfect language to express themselves how they are facing the disaster and how they are living the life of disaster. This is why I say that even though they are not educated, they should be included in such a space like this internationally. Take the table, take the space to voice their concern, because their voices are still not heard. I also say that if we continue to engage them internationally, and if we continue to engage them, they will play a greater leadership role in the community. And as we are looking at better building of our communities, I say that if we continue to involve the women in the community at a grassroots level, and if they come to know more of their rights, as such they would advocate better and build a better community for all. Thank you.
Many thanks, Ms. Jack. We hear you. I hear you. Mr. Sweeney, over to you. Adaptive social protection is often mentioned as one of the solutions to build back better, and Jamaica has a quite advanced and impressive adaptive protection system. In your view, what is needed to build a good foundation for an adaptive social protection that builds back stronger, faster, and more inclusively at once? What are the main challenges that you see based on your experiences from Jamaica in the context of social protection?
Thank you, and I also want to thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I also wanted to start by endorsing what my colleague just said, because women are really the owners of the communities we work in. And it's my own experience that when we enter communities, especially after disaster, they're the ones present, trying to solve the problems. Jamaica's social protection system has been built. It's nowhere near perfect, but it has been built around targeting and data. And our premier social protection system, which is our PATH program. PATH means Program of Advancement Through Health and Education. It's an acronym. And through our PATH program, there's really a means testing that would provide cash transfers and other benefits to the poor and the vulnerable, but mostly single-headed households are the beneficiaries of the PATH program. We cross-reference that with what is known as our poverty map, right? It's a spatial map that tells us where the poor are, and it's also supported by what we call the Community Renewal Program, which is a program that actually names and identifies the 100 most vulnerable communities in Jamaica. So typically what happens is if there is a disaster, or even before the disaster comes, if you are able to predict, like in the case of hurricanes, you have a good idea of, based on where it's going to hit, you have a good idea of who is going to be affected and how they're going to be affected. We've supported that by also including in our development financing what's known as a CIRC, and CIRC's another acronym, which means if you work with the World Bank, there's a lot of acronyms. The CERC is the Contingency Emergency Response Component. And to give a practical example, what the CERC will allow is, in the case of a disaster, undisbursed balances on any particular development loan would flow into the PATH program for emergency assistance as a result of the disaster. So you're able, as a government with challenged financial resources, to provide quick cash transfers. You would want to say almost in 24 hours, you'd be able to have access to that cash to provide the type of response. And so that's the foundation of where we are. But beyond everything I just said, there are gaps. Okay, a significant gap in our program is what we call pockets of poverty. Right, pockets of poverty are communities that become attached, if you want to say, to urban centers and commerce. So you may have a small community that's beside a major market or a major business district or affluent homes where persons end up settling there simply because of the access to the livelihood. And what happens is that becomes a community now that's, if you will, off the radar. So when you have situations there, you're not so easily be able to respond or adapt to that situation because they don't fall in any of the gaps. Because, for example, if they go to the PATH program and apply, the PATH program means testing database would not necessarily pick up where they're from because it's an affluent community on the map, if you understand. And so it doesn't actually pick them up, and they have no basis to really form the assessment that would enable them. So the persons continue to live in that situation without the assessment. So you have to have other systems that really help to program that. And so that's one of the challenges, of course. In response to the Building Back Better, I would only say that one of the things that we do, and I encourage all the time, is that we have to think about building back better when the times are good, right? When the times are good. So if you're engaged in communities around agriculture, for example, right? You can teach them good agricultural practices, but you also have to teach them what happens if a storm destroys your crop, right? But you don't. So you don't wait until the storm actually comes. That's integrated in a part of our interaction, and so we consider climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction as a total cross-cutting theme, whether we're talking about like I said, agriculture, whether we're talking about livelihoods, whether we're talking about crime prevention, right? Whether keeping your community clean, keeping your drains clean. It's not only for disaster risk reduction, but it's also to prevent crime. It's a crime prevention initiative, and so it's sort of a way to build the awareness of persons and build the capacity, because the last point I'll make is that local governance or local leadership is important, and you're going to have to depend on local leadership to drive the building back better, but you're going to also have to depend on local leadership to drive the response, the first responders, and that capacity has to be there. So if you're trying to manage and provide a social protection framework, then what you have to do is build your structures. I mean, you saw in there I'm an engineer, so I build structures. And so you have to build those structures so that when the time comes to respond and to ensure that you really have the type of social protection and resilience that you need, those structures have to be built and they have to be maintained. So that gives you the best opportunity when disaster strikes. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. So we have time for another round of questions. So I would like to go back to Ms. Riley and building a bit on what Mr. Sweeney said about the importance of data. So to build back more inclusively in post-disaster relief, recovery, and reconstruction efforts, it really needs, post-disaster reconstruction and recovery really needs the whole population that are affected by disaster to be properly identified. And in order to do that, we need to know who they are, who the most affected are. So how can the use of sex, age, and disability disaggregated data ensure that no one is left behind? And do you have any best practices to share from the Caribbean?
Yeah, thank you very much, Cindy. And yes, I really would like to build on the contributions by Mr. Sweeney, which are, of course, fully supported. The use of sex, age, and disability disaggregated data is really about making informed decisions. And informed decisions which will address the needs of vulnerable groups within the population. And I would like to add another set of data which is related to persons who fall within the category receiving social welfare, because this is another part of the data that's required to really make the best types of decisions. So this will include children, of course the elderly, because certainly within the Caribbean we have seen and we are going through demographic shifts where we have larger percentages of our populations now falling within the category of the elderly. So I have, in fact, two examples to share a little bit about. The first is related to Grenada, post-Hurricane Ivan 2004, and I see Mr. Sylvan McIntyre here, who is the National Emergency Management Coordinator from Grenada. And in Grenada, post-Hurricane Ivan, there was an ad hoc cabinet-sanctioned emergency housing committee that was set up in the aftermath of the impact of Ivan. And the composition of this committee sought to draw information on these vulnerable groups. And it would have included, for example, the Council for the Disabled, the Ministry with responsibility for social welfare, Physical Planning Unit, Ministry of Education. It also included non-governmental organizations, including women's organizations, and of course the National Emergency Management Office, and other parties as well. And this committee would have utilized this information to inform the prioritization process for the post-Ivan reconstruction related to housing. And whilst this was not at the time enshrined within policy, what is important is that it reflected the understanding by the government of Grenada on the need to address vulnerable groups in the prioritization process post the impact. And in fact, the legacy of that experience is reflected even today, where there is sustained engagement of these groups with respect to decision making. The second example comes from the British Virgin Islands, which was impacted by Hurricane Irma in 2017. And in addressing the housing reconstruction, there's a housing policy in the BVI, and this defined particular criteria in terms of how that prioritization process took place in the aftermath of Irma for housing interventions. And some of the areas that were spoken to directly within the policy were related to gender, where there was a specific recognition of the needs of not only single mothers, but also single fathers in the policy. Age was one of the considerations, level of vulnerability. They also looked at the capacity of individuals to be able to recover on their own. In other words, were they covered by insurance or had any other means. And in the BVI, there were additional considerations because if you know anything about the BVI, BVI has a large, what we call a transient population. There are many workers who come in to work under contract for specific periods of time and often will then transition back out to home country or to another area. So in the BVI case, the housing policy also gave consideration to those transient populations and the specific immigration status that persons would have held. In the discussions with the BVI team, though, in preparation for this session, one of the things they indicated to me that they needed to now expand the policy to include was related to the whole issue of land tenure, particularly as it related to elderly persons. And in BVI, there's a specific scenario, and I think in many of the Caribbean countries, where persons will live on what we call family land, where the land belongs to the family, but the actual title of the land is not exactly clear because there are many persons who might have been entitled to have title to the land, but it has not been legally sorted. So this was one of the challenges that they faced in applying the housing policy in the aftermath of Irma, and one of the areas that they want to strengthen going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. So, Ms. Leger, we know that, I know, because I've been talking to you a lot for the last few days, that your passion is really about to help communities building back better at the local level. And how can we better encourage and support communities for self-recovery related to housing specifically, given that that's the area that you work with? And how do you, what role do you think that community-based organizations or NGOs can play in to support that?
Thank you, Cindy. I'd like to follow up on what my colleague, Mr. Sweeney, was saying about building resilient structures, reducing risk before we build back better. So I'm focusing on three points, which are raising the awareness at the community level, and second, enforcing regulatory framework at the government level, and third one is a mutual understanding. First one, raising the awareness at the community level on technical assistance in support to self-recovery. Our local government is playing many important roles in supporting and coordinating housing recovery on the ground. With that being said, they should be given the necessary resources to support these functions. Community also has to be more involved in the technical trainings to gain skills that can also support the unemployment. Our NGOs during Tropical Cyclone Kita, they were engaged in retrofitting. They had their own retrofitting programs, and part of that programs includes training along the way. They train the community as well as they're retrofitting the houses. The government, my next point will be the enforcing the regulatory framework at the government level, because as a core function of the ministry, they should make the building codes and standards available at the community level. What currently is happening is that we have a pre-designed housing to standards available also for the community. Building trading license is also a key for having skilled carpenters licensed before they build a house or building. So these skilled carpenters should, we all know in construction in remote islands, if they are licensed or not licensed, they still build a house. So this is also a core function to the ministry to enforce this and actually check construction, whether the builder is actually licensed and they are building the permitted plans and that was approved from the ministry. So, and also the third one, mutual understanding, as my colleague here was talking about the issues of the land. We also have that in Tonga, between the communities, the identification of affected households and the selection of beneficiaries is at the core of recovery planning. I'll give an example from TCEN in 2014 in Tonga. The issue was there were people in some houses. The land is owned by a relative or a family friend, but they have stayed there for more than 20 years. So, and they are affected by the cyclone. So who are we supposed to give the support to? The household owner that was affected or the landowner that wasn't? So that was one of the key challenges that delayed the response in the reconstruction for DCN, which was the selection of the beneficiary. Yeah, I think that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you. Interesting to see how you have some of common issues. Yeah. So, Miss Jack, gender norms influence, as you know, how women and men prepare for, react to, and recover from disasters. And we have seen great evidence that when gender is taken into consideration, the needs and capacities of women and men, also men, are better met in post-disaster recovery. So in your view, why is gender often overlooked in post-disaster recovery? Is it a lack of understanding? Is it a lack of will, lack of capacity? Why do you think we're still having these issues?
Thank you again. I think in my first point I made, I said that women have a perfect language to express themselves or talk about disaster and climate change. I also want to say that if there is a leaking house, if the house is leaking, the rain comes and the house leaks, it's the women who tell the husband that the house is leaking. So I say that the people in the planning office or people in taking decisions on how there will be a recovery planning. When women are not included, this is a problem because women are not included in the planning process of recovery. And at all times when women are not included because they think that women are not very much educated, this is a time where they come, the decision makers do not really realize that women have value. They have the value of knowledge, the knowledge of talking about the disaster. And for this reason, I am calling for more meaningful participation of women in decision making, so that their voices could be heard. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I was wondering, I just have like one extra question for you, is could you tell a little bit about the network that you have established and what you do concretely?
Actually, Australia has given support to the women in Vanuatu to set up this network. During the time of disaster, after the disaster, the cyclone Pam, when when the humanitarian agencies were on the ground, there was a provincial disaster committee, but no women was included. The women, only men are included in this provincial disaster committee. So we set up a safe space, and this safe space is called Women in Talk Together, and it is a forum for all women that came together to discuss and take collective decision to address issues that is affecting them. So this forum becomes very powerful. We established this forum in 3 islands, in Tana, Eromango, and Efate. And they are working together to take decisions on how they can build back their lives. It is very powerful in a way that the local chief in the community are also recognizing women, and they are also part of, for example, this International Women's Day this year, the first time that the chief has awarded 4 women to recognize them in what they are doing in the community. So yes, there is a culture, there is a barrier, but women are moving forward, and women are taking the lead in disaster preparedness. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mr. Sweeney, for adaptive social protection to work efficiently, it needs to be able to identify both those that are chronically poor and those that are likely to suffer temporary poverty because of a disaster shock. And the first is quite a challenge in itself, but the second part seems even more challenging. Can you explain what Jamaica is doing to identify and reach those at risk of falling into poverty because of a disaster?
Okay, so I spoke earlier about the type of data and the metrics that we use. There is also what we call the survey of living conditions. And the survey of living conditions, it's done about every 3 years, 3 to 5 years. And it looks at investments that have flowed into communities over the period. And so you will find, for example, if in 2015 the parish of St. Mary was ranked as the poorest parish because, and then our investments would flow. And truthfully, as I sit here, JSIP represents the arm of government that provides those investments. And so this year we will invest 7% of the national budget towards these vulnerable communities. And we monitor and evaluate to see if those investments have taken root against something like the survey of living conditions. And so you may find now that St. Mary is no longer the poorest, and now it moves to another parish. So that's one of the areas. So this week, in fact, we're launching the new poverty map, which I'm excited because I will see whether we've gotten any root in some areas. Now, I wanted to say that we've added, for instance, drought as a new climate disaster risk. And one of the investments we've made, for example, is in the parish of St. Elizabeth, where they produce, there's a direct connection from the agricultural output from the parish of St. Elizabeth to our GDP. And we've seen where our growth numbers have been reduced because of drought, the effects of drought. And so the persons, the small farmers, these are not large farmers or multinationals, these are small farmers that collectively provide that output. And so one of the investments we've made is we've now have all farmers in the parish, all the farming groups now have access in terms of own drip irrigation equipment. And so that's a drought mitigation factor. And that's how so I spoke about not just wait until the drought comes. I mean, obviously we've seen it, and so we've taken those steps to see how we can manage the persons that would be most at risk. And so between the survey of living conditions, between mitigation factors, and between what we call strategic investments, one of the challenges most countries like ours face is that we can't get enough resources to spend for social safety net spending. And so, like anything else, when you don't have that, you have to make strategic investments. And those, if you're going to make strategic investments, then you're going to have the not only have the information, you have to have the right information. And so we spend a lot of time really looking at data, looking at the information, looking at where people are, and monitoring the programs, because the thing we're looking at most right now is what we call the effectiveness of delivery of social programs, right? Because it's one thing to get the resources, make the investments, but you also have to assess the effectiveness of delivery. And the effectiveness of delivery has to do with the capacity of state agents to effectively deliver the product. Because many times we know the money's there, and the budget year ends and the money is not spent, right? And so it comes back to what, you start looking and you're saying, what is the capacity of the implementers to really deliver the benefits to the persons? Because certainly the demand is there, right? The resources have been put there, but at the end of the year you assess and you see that the money is not spent. And so that is an area of focus right now in terms of across government, looking at it. There's another thing we call joined up government, or because the silo effect of government sometimes affects implementation. And so one of the reasons social investment funds are supposed to bridge those silos in terms of being able to cut across sectors and deliver or facilitate the delivery of benefits. And nonetheless, the social investment fund can't do everything. So you still have to look across government and see where there are gaps and where the benefits are not being delivered. Because we may say, okay, we're going to invest, for an example I used, in the drip irrigation system, but outreach service of the agricultural ministry to the farmers in terms of how to use it, how to maintain it, how to make sure that it's being effective. If that's not in place, then you will still not get the kind of outputs that you're looking for. And so overall, that's one of the ways. The next great challenge that we face is the matter of, it was said earlier, resettlement and land titling. Those persons are the ones that you think about would be most at risk if disaster strikes. And I like to say, unfortunately, our Crown system of land management, inherited from the British, is very restrictive in terms of how land can be transferred to persons. And so the current laws that prevail are very restrictive in terms of how land can be transferred to persons. And so that's a long-term activity. And so you don't necessarily have the time to resolve those situations. So despite a number of studies done on resettlement and despite the number of studies done on where people are, we can't really bridge the gap to necessarily make the type of investments we need to make because the land tenure is not regularized. So in the interim, you just have to rely on the normal systems of protection that I've already spoken about in terms of dealing with those persons that would be at risk. And it's just to say that if anyone here has been in a country or lived in a country when disasters strike, it almost doesn't matter who you are, it's a shock, right? It doesn't really matter who you are. And so certainly you can just imagine the persons at the bottom of the pyramid are mostly affected. And so a national response that can be fair and equitable to all is really what's important. And so a big part of protecting those most at risk is to ensure that they have a means of advocacy. They have a means of achieving equity when the time comes, because international resources will flow in, but then there are other barriers that would prevent persons from coming there. And so that means of protection, in some instances, it can be political, but for the most part, what you want is for persons to be able to understand how they can go from being where they are to having that means. And then that flows back to one of the strongest things we believe in, which is local leadership. Building community-based organizations that are fair, that have wide representation, right, and have a voice. And so it doesn't cost that much to invest in those things. It's really about volunteerism and leadership, and animation, really. And so if you're able to continue to do that, then you stand the best chance of really having some form of protection for those most at risk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sweeney, for those interesting remarks, and also to the rest of you. I think we've managed to cover quite a broad range in terms of building back better and inclusive recovery, from discussing like what the challenges of building back better is, to the importance of promoting women's leadership and the great role that adaptive social protection plays to ensure inclusion and that no one is left behind in recovery, as exemplified by Jamaica. Now it's time to open the floor for questions. We still have 20 minutes for questions. So maybe we can start with a few questions, and then we'll give the panelists a chance to respond, and then we go back for another round if necessary. So you first, Mr. McIntyre? Okay. Oh, sorry, maybe we can use the mic if it works. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. I had a quick question for Ms. Ledger, for Ms. Ledger. When you were talking about the building materials used in Tonga and governments removing the tariff to import better building materials, I know that your population is really small, but there are economic impacts on importation of building materials as well. So I was wondering if you were considering any sort of local manufacture of some of the components, even though your community is really small, just to be able to balance that, additional outflow of income.
Thank you. The tax exemption was only for the building materials and only for 2 years, so it's not for the whole thing. And there's also, of course, we had met with the local construction suppliers they have offered to reduce their price in the building materials in that case. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me commend the selection of the group of panelists. I think was well thought out and so forth, and well reflected. I do not have a direct question, but I will hope that my comments, that questions will be drawn from it and answers hereafter will be sought or maybe provided. I've been following the process of rebuilding since 2004, my direct involvement after Hurricane Ivan. And prior to that, Grenada had a hurricane about 49 years prior, and there was a different mindset. And the whole, what I consider now it could either be referred to as an old cliche or an adage, the whole concept or the statement of building back better, that's when I was first exposed to it. My finding at this point, though, is whether that process of building back better is advanced, and whether it is reflected and informed in a real practical or scientific mean, or whether or not the building back better is supported by any real form of data. I am not sure at this stage that building back better is really reflective in what we are doing, and we are reporting, or we are able to justify that we are actually building back better. And I pay particular attention to building back faster. Now, if we are building back faster, are we saying that faster means better? We are saying stronger, maybe to replace better. And we're saying inclusive, meaning that we're not just looking at the physical infrastructure, but we're looking at the impact on gender. We're looking at the disadvantaged people in our society, and that's good, inclusively. But my strongest point here is, and I want to be convinced, that after 14 years in my own experience, what kind of a monitoring and evaluating mechanism that have been implemented, we have identified that one of our weaknesses has been our inability to enforce legislation, to enforce the policies, and to outfit our physical planning and our town planning units to effectively monitor and implement to ensure that things are built back better. I would hope in a not too distant future, if not in this platform, that we would be able to produce a progressive status in terms of saying, at this stage, this is where we were. X amount of buildings were destroyed because of X factors. And today, this is where we are because such have been implemented, and it is supported by real data. This is the kind of a feeling I want to get at this stage. I do not want to sit at a platform or at a forum or at a conference where we can, eloquently articulate the building back. It sounds really nice. It is cool. But I would want you to be able to convince me more through information and data that this is where we were. And I am hoping that we are really taking early cognizance of that. And it is happening, but I'm not aware. And so we will be able to produce it. And if that is not done, those partners and interest groups who are within the hearing of my voice, I may not necessarily be, but would put resources into ensuring that the enforcing mechanism, the evaluating mechanisms are there to really prove that we can build back more inclusively, we can build back better, and not necessarily faster. I rest.
Would any of you like to comment on that? Yeah.
Well, Mr. McIntyre, you achieved your desired effect. It just triggered me to comment. So I think I agree with Mr. McIntyre's intervention. And you recall where I started was in terms of really defining what is meant by Build Back Better, particularly within the SIDS context. And I do think that there's a need for us to invest in the articulation of the specific metrics for Build Back Better. So, for example, on the stronger side, I think we would want to see specific design criteria that we want to ensure and we are able to measure. And the design criteria, as I indicated, would need to take into consideration the multi-hazard context within which we operate. I think also the other side of the design is one thing, but it's about confirming that what has been designed is actually then what is constructed. And there needs to be a side of the metrics where we are able to give some level of account as to the inspection and verification of what it is that has actually been built. I think we talk about faster as well, but the question is what kinds of time frames should guide that reconstruction process? What is acceptable? You know, and I think that's something that's open for conversation and certainly would be informed by the extent of the damage and impact that has taken place. And inclusive, we've talked about a little bit more. So I'm, you know, it leads me to even ask the question as to whether the Build Back Better terminology, if we're able to define it by these particular metrics, is it something that really should be applicable only to longer term reconstruction, but also integrated to the broader development context in terms of the regular investment, the development investment that is ongoing? And I also think it is very much linked into the whole conversation we started at the CISRI meeting, where we were talking about the discussion around the disaster risk financing policy. Remember, we discussed that with respect to Jamaica, and the whole importance of integrating ex-ante financing for mitigation measures. So the build, I don't know if it's build back better or if it's build better. You know, I think this is one of the things that we need to look at. So that's my contribution. Thank you, Mr. McIntyre, for prompting.
I'll just say on the technical side of this question. In every country, they have different kind of capacity and challenges. So we can't say that we are able to build back better in like, 2 days or what. Every country has its own capability to be able to recover from, like from a technical side, you can't just give the building code to the community to be able to learn the next day to build it back better. It's also the capacity of that country to be able to do that. But actually, from what we're hearing from all the smaller island developing states, they are progressing well with the Build Back Better, as well as Tonga in some way. But it's a matter of learning process, because we are trying to just let the information sink in, then we are able to come up stronger. That's all. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to thank Mr. McIntyre for the same question. We were similarly impacted by, not similar, Grenada was bad, but we were impacted by Hurricane Ivan also in 2004. And we saw where schools, which normally form hurricane shelters, had their roofs destroyed. And that did lead to the change in the specifications for the roofs of those buildings. Beyond that, since then, we've had in Jamaica, in 2016, we launched the Jamaican adaptation document to the International Building Code. And last year, the government passed the new Building Act. Now, we could say those are concrete things, but we could still say that codes and acts don't make better buildings, right? Because you still need to have enforcements and capacity of persons to inspect, and you need to have a skilled workforce that understands what the code is and how to do it. That continuum, I would say to you, we are still on that continuum. And whether since 2004 till now has been too long of a time, I probably would say yes. But we also have to move at the speed that we can move at. And so we have to continue to fight and drill down. But I think for us, we are making those concrete steps that we can say will lead to us having the ability to build better, as we say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyone else? So, you maybe? So maybe we can do, because I saw 4 or 5 hands, so maybe we can take the two of you at the same time, and then we'll do that. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I am Ciro Ugarte. I'm the Director of Health Emergencies of the Pan American Health Organization, Regional Office of WHO for the Americas. Of course, we're talking about all this building faster, stronger, and looking at evidence. After the earthquake in Mexico, the Americas began their mitigation route in '85. And after 20 years of frustration and a lot of work on trying to solve all the problems of all health facilities, after Hurricane Ivan and some other disasters, the health sector learned that we have to prioritize and to look beyond the structure. And the Safe Hospitals Initiative began in 2004 in the Americas and was adopted by the global platform in Japan in 2005 as a global priority. Still, we are far from there. But because of the several hurricanes also in the Caribbean small island development states, the country said this is being safe hospitals, so the probability of continued functioning is a reality in many countries. But all the countries now have the information which hospitals will continue functioning after a disaster. That information is available and should be public. It is not something that should be secret. And that information is available. But still, because of all those issues and climate change, the countries in the Caribbean also began the implementation of climate adaptation and mitigation in health facilities that's called smart hospitals. And all the evidence, cost-benefit analysis, community participation, not only in the design of the hospitals, town hall meetings in each of the hospitals, the community has to participate and look, the elderly homes, the smart shelters for emergencies, and many other initiatives are being implemented in the Caribbean. And the Minister of Health of Grenada will present one of the examples of the smart hospitals in the global platform. So there is evidence. That's what I want to share. There is evidence. There is hope. There is something that is happening, and we need to take a look at that. Because in those issues, we are looking at the building codes and the participation of the communities, but, nobody asked me, for example, what is the curriculum of the education, on higher education of medical schools, even though I am the Director of Health Emergencies of PAHO, and also a member of the community. So when we are talking about inclusion of disaster risk reduction, it's far from there. So when we are talking about inclusion, maybe we're talking about changing the world, and we will land in 10 years, 20 years from now in a frustration. We need to prioritize. We need to measure what we are going to advance, who are going to be included in the next year, in the next 5 years. What are the progress that we have to make in building back faster, stronger, inclusive? Who, how, when? So if we don't measure that, everything will be philosophy. Everything will be going back and forth, and we will be talking about 20 years, 30 years from now. And unfortunately, we will not get progress. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you're next.
Thank you very much. I came from the Nagasaki University. I'm an advisor for global relations of Nagasaki University. The reason why I am attracted by your meeting is that Nagasaki has the greatest number of isolated islands. Nagasaki is one en français, département, the prefecture. We have 971 islands. So the more than 15% of the isolated islands of Japan are located in Nagasaki. And my university started the kind of assistance program to Nagasaki Islands. So, and we sense that the urbanization which is taking place globally, even the globalization, accelerates the exodus of inhabitants of islands in Nagasaki. 5% per year is the rate of diminution in the population of islands, of these islands. So within 5 or 10 years, there would be nobody living there. We are so concerned with this. And we applied the concept of SDGs. We developed a strategy called the Islands SDG. So, and if any hurricane or typhoon comes, earthquake attacks, that will trigger exodus of people. If the livelihood, if the community is entirely destroyed, so people are forced to leave. They take a decision to leave islands. So this is a kind of concern we have. And then question is not palliative or emergency measures to be mobilized, but we should introduce SDG concept. So I was very much touched by your remarks that there are health and education problems, there's inequality among genders, and all the decision making for recovery has been decided by somebody else. So we are looking at this aspect, how we can apply SDGs, how we can cope with vice of globalization. Then what we discovered is that we should not concentrate only on the problem of islands. We didn't have people there, but people are attracted by the major island and major towns. What is the policy of major towns? What's the policy of the municipalities, which attract these people? I wonder whether you have any idea how you can stop the exodus of your people to the United States or to the major, the capital centers in the world. That is also, the element which drive, diminution of your populations. So I wonder whether, my concept is valid to explain your situation. I think I think that the panacea is to apply literally SDG concept. Yeah, I think that would strengthen resilience for any future, the natural hazards. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we unfortunately only have 5 minutes left, and I also but I also want to give an opportunity to. I saw that there were at least 2. Yeah. So Mary, please, and then you go next, and then we'll give you a last chance to choose between all these interesting questions to answer.
Thank you, Cindy. My question goes for Oma. It's about resettlement and land. I'm really interested in your points because I come from one of the most vulnerable islands in the Solomon Islands. It's a low-lying atoll, and resettlement it's not a choice, but it's the only option left for people. So when I look at the word build back faster and stronger and more inclusively, I think that is more relevant for big islands that have space. For very low-lying islands, I think building back faster and stronger, it's not really possible because there is no more space. Because if say a cyclone hits or tidal waves hit those islands, then whatever little land there is, it's already gone. So they cannot really build back better or faster on those existing lands. So the only choice for them is to relocate elsewhere. However, from my observation, resettlement is an issue which a lot of governments really struggle with. And from my observations in the Solomon Islands, like our government and their development partners try their best, but I think it's an issue that everybody struggles to deal with because of all the land problems associated with it. And for example, last year, like our people were calling, we need to be relocated, but there was no land, and I think our government still need to have a resettlement policy and more resettlement discussions. So there was a group of us from our island who tried to create a group to be the voice for our people. So my question is, like, you mentioned something about having a space for advocacy for people to have a voice, so that there is protection of those people at risk. But when there is a lack of space for those low-lying islands to have that voice, then how do you really create that space? And the other question is, like, do you have any success stories from Jamaica or your region where you have some successful stories about resettlement? Because I think the core issue where some of those low-lying islands have is really space to build back better or to have better livelihoods. Because in our small low-lying islands, like, our livelihoods are affected, and even some of our graves, like, it's already exposed and the bones are out. So, like, this adds on another risk to our people's livelihood, especially when it comes to water and health services. So I think resettlement is a key issue which really needs to be discussed at international forums, because it's not the only option, but it's the only choice left for some of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. And then the last question.
Yeah, thank you, Cindy, for moderating and also giving me time to contribute. I come from South Sudan, and my name is Banak Joshua. I'm a DRR practitioner in South Sudan. Like the other speakers, I was also inspired by the title. So I want to get the gist of the meaning of what, because we have been talking about the Build Back Better, and it looked like the previous speakers thought, what is measurable, then you will say that we are now building back better. This is very important key. But I think I still buy in the word faster, because in some instances, you will have this disaster now, and while you are trying to respond to the disaster, another disaster happens. And I think that's very important for us to be compliant, that some people say that, floods come every 5 years, but we have seen in the recent years that flood can come even today and then again tomorrow, and even stronger. So I think the word faster is finding a good place. And even the stronger, it means that it's stronger than before, so that when the same disaster happen again, then people will be well prepared. My experience that, many of you maybe, the islands are islands and are prone to cyclones. My country is a landlocked country, so we are lucky in that we don't have cyclone, but also again, we are also very unfortunate that we have another type of hazards like conflict. So South Sudan has experienced conflict from 1955 until 1972. We had a little bit of a respite. 2 million people were displaced. Again in 1983, maybe this is the war that you may all know, went for 21 years. A lot of people, 4 million people displaced. Now, when you see this, and even now, we are in war again, starting from 2013. So the life from 1955 up to today, 41 years or 42 years, this country has been in conflict. So do you think that we have opportunity to build back better within these 3 wars? It is impossible. It is impossible. So it means that if we have to build back faster, we need to capitalize on the vulnerable people, the people who are returning home. I think the governance system here has to play a very big role. But the governance system has to play a big role with the involvement of the community. Because sometimes we think that aid is a solution, but yes, it is a solution because it brings us food, brings us shelters, temporary, but is it sustainable? I think it's not sustainable. Our communities have more sustainable strategies. I'm hearing my brother Omar saying that sometimes one of the challenges is that you have money left over from a project. I was struck because most of the people, you are looking for money to implement project. One of the reasons why the project money, if I got him right, the project money is not spent. It's because the design of the project itself did not come from the grassroots, because they know what they need. And if they know what they need, even the additional capacities will not come here. Actually, we are spending more time talking about capacity. It's not realistic. Capacities are there. What type of capacity do you want to implement a project? Because these people, they can cultivate, they can build their houses, right? Are you saying that you need an engineer to come and build a house? No, they know how to live. The second point I just want to make quickly is inclusivity and the role of women. I hope we are not saying women should come into the lead in terms of managing disasters or even the governance to replace men. I hope not. What we mean here is to have equal opportunity for everyone, because we have seen also other governments bringing people up politically, but they do not necessarily deliver. Even they cannot even manage a situation of disaster. So let us be also realistic that if we need equality and inclusivity in managing disasters, we must also employ the attitude of having educated class, people who can understand things as the world move forward and build back better. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for sharing the South Sudan experience, which is very, very different, but I also see that there are many common issues in terms of dealing with hazards. Just on your last point, of course, advancing women's leadership in the ERR, it's not about undermining men. It's about the equal opportunities and equal outcomes. So I see that we have I don't want to keep you too much away from your lunches, but given that you had many interesting questions, I would like to know if you would like to give brief comments on, maybe not all of them because we don't have time, but yeah. Do you want to start?
Yeah, thank you, Cindy. Very briefly, just to support the observations by my colleague from PAHO. And certainly, I think we've seen some successes with respect to the Safe Hospitals initiative in the Caribbean. In the BVI, for example, People's Hospitals stood up to the Category 5+ IRMA. And in fact, the Emergency Operations Center had to be relocated there. I myself was there sleeping on the floor. So yes, we have seen some successes. I also think with respect to other sectors, we're seeing progress as well. So in the education sector, we have in support of the Global Safe Schools Initiative, we have a Caribbean Safe Schools Initiative that has been launched, and certainly within that we are looking at issues related to the construction of schools and various criteria, etc. And I think Mrs. Sweeney gave an example of what's been happening in Jamaica with respect to that. Just a comment on the delegate from Nagasaki University. Professor, thank you. I think you asked about how do you really stop that migration. Of course, we experience a lot of migration out of the Caribbean states as well. And I don't know the full details of the Japanese context, but what I can say is that we have been working in the Caribbean, and it's been accepted by the heads of government on a framework for resilience. And one of the critical things within there is related to economic opportunity. And I think that if this is one that if we are successful in addressing it, it does assist with the retention of the population. And on the relocation matter from the Solomon Islands, I know our geographical context is in some spaces a bit different. We do have an example of a successful a relocation, I should say, that's in progress, coming out of Dominica, Tropical Storm Erica back in 2015, where we had to look at the relocation of a community called Petite Savane. But of course, it's a mountainous country. So, I mean, in terms of compared to your topographic reality, it's a bit different. But there have been a couple of resettlement exercises in the Caribbean, yes.
Thank you. I would like to just comment on, because there's like one from Mexico, Japan, and Sudan, and they're all big countries compared to mine. So I don't really know the context in your countries, but what I do know is you guys have the capacity, and the only one thing I'm looking at is prioritizing your investment in these. Is it practical to if you're saying that the migration that they should be staying in there, but would it have a benefit in your urban development, or is it better to migrate than? I mean, I'm just trying to see which one is the best option. Having to, satisfy them, but will affect. Is it practical to actually help them, or would there be no solutions at all when they are living in them? I mean, you guys have the capacity. I'm not so sure, but but what I think is what are you guys' investments are on to be? Well, that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Jack, do you have any last comments?
Thank you. I think my statement this afternoon was not that women will take the lead, but it is a collective decision. That it is a collective decision that.
Honestly, why not? Women and men have been running things for how very long? The source of a lot of the conflict that's taking place.
Yeah,
I think we shouldn't shy away from women taking the lead. So
See the panel here.
Yeah, I would just say not replacing.
why not?
No, but women are taking the lead in the community. In this aspect.
Very good. So, Mr. Sweeney, any last remarks from your side?
I only reflect in the interactions we had. I wanted to reflect a little bit on the two statements from the Japan professor and from Mary. When you start to discuss people staying, resettlement, people staying or leaving where they are, in my experience, the value of that place has to be understood. People value where they are for cultural reasons, for family reasons, for economic reasons. And it's easy for the state or a development agency or someone to say, that place has that value and they should move, right? Or they should stay where they are. But until you really get into the conversation and understand why, even in your own country, there's conflict, but people stay. Yeah? There's conflict for the last 40 years, you said, but people stay, right? Because there is a value there. And we've understood, especially in our resettlement discussions, the difference between when the state values a place and when the people say, well, this is what. We have in our resettlement framework, we have what we call a matrix of assessment, and we engage the community and we talk about the different things before we even get into any other discussion. And I can tell you that almost in every single instance, what we went in thinking was the value was different. And so to address any situation like that, I would encourage that there really is an open-eyed look at the value of those places. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I see that we're very out of time, but I just wanted to make some brief remarks at the end. I just want to really thank the panelists here for taking their time to come and share their stories. They deserve a huge round of applause. Just one comment, because one of the reasons why we wanted to have this discussion about building back better is obviously because we understand that in theory it looks really, really nice, but also given that for the last 3 years I've also worked with small island states specifically, I've also seen like the challenges on the ground, and that's why we thought it would be useful to have a real discussion about it. Hopefully we can, Mr. McIntyre, next time we talk about Build Back Better again, you're absolutely right. And I mean, this is the starting point. It's not, we'll see where we go from here. So, but thank you so much for all your comments and your questions. And it was good to see such a good turnout. And I hope that next time we have events on SIDS, you will show up. Thank you.